Hello, sisters. Okay. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges, edited by the Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Section 2, Relationships. Part 1, Essay 8. The Impact of Race and Cultural Differences. Challenges to Intimacy in Lesbian Relationships by Norma Garcia, Cheryl Kennedy, Sarah F. Pearlman, and Julia Perez. This chapter is based on a transcription of a conversation between 4 women. 2 are Puerto Rican, 1 is Jewish, and 1 is Irish American. 3 of these women are therapists, and the 4th, Cheryl, works in human services. Cheryl and Julia are lovers and live together with their 3 daughters. Sarah and Norma have recently become friends. Norma is also Julia's sister. We hope that conversations like this can bring deeper understanding of the challenges and complexities of interracial relationships, and understanding that will be helpful to women in interracial relationships as friends and lovers, and also to therapists who may be working with women who are struggling with racial and cultural differences in their relationships. The purpose of this conversation we present here is to discuss issues of race and culture that affect intimacy in lesbian relationships. Being a lesbian can and does offer multiple opportunities and challenges, as well as difficulties. As a group, we are enormously diverse, our one established similarity being our relationships and sexual choice. As lesbians, we can have the opportunity to make contact with women who are different from ourselves in class, age, race, education, ability, and geographical background. While this diversity of experience can be greatly enriching and expanding, changing our thinking and our sense of the world and others is by no means a simple or uncomplicated matter. In particular, interracial relationships confront and challenge our most racist selves, our stereotypes, assumptions, and prejudices towards those who are different. Although one's racist self m- may not be so much malicious as ignorant or insensitive, a woman who loves another who is racially different can cause particular hurts in that relationship. The white woman can experience pain because of self consciousness and shame of her racist ignorance and stereotypical thinking. She knows that at any point she can hurt her lover or friend with her multiple, often unwanted feelings and by what she can say, intended or unintended. The woman of color experiences pain in alternating layers of hurt and rage and knows that at any time the person closest can further open already raw wounds, that the person closest can also be the enemy. The woman of color is capable of hurting and retaliating through cultural insult. To the extent that there are differences in culture, one's perspective on the world can change. Lack of familiarity with each other's cultural values and habits means that both women can be unpredictable to each other. What what is humorous teasing to one woman can be insulting and offensive to the other. What is of concern to one may be nonsense to the other. Differences in attitudes towards money, child rearing, expressions of anger, and other feelings multiply the potential for conflict. What then becomes crucial is ongoing discussion and the deciphering of misunderstandings if the relationship is to remain successful and loving. Yet differences are also fascinating and erotic and thrilling as each adapts to the other's ways, as a new culture of the particular relationship begins to flower with growing closeness and trust. An interracial relationship entails a particularly painful struggle, made evident during this conversation as the participants themselves confront cultural assumptions and values that lead to misunderstandings and anger. Moving past anger, the participants hope for connection. Finally, as women to women, as individuals clear and unclouded by the social poison that has affected us all. Beyond relationships between individual women is the issue of race and lesbian community, especially in communities like Boston that are deeply affected by antagonism and separatism among women of different races. These four women hope that conversations like the following are the beginning of a necessary, long, and continuing process. The conversation. Sarah. I'm white, Jewish, raised middle class. Actually, more complicated than that. We were poor, but our values and assumptions were middle class, particularly with regard to behavior, conforming to what was acceptable. This was very much my mother's influence. Due to her experience as an immigrant child and her intense desire to assimilate and to have her children be acceptable in America. My grandparents had emigrated from Russia, and I had the wonderful opportunity of growing up within a Yiddish immigrant culture before Americanizing really diluted it. My sense of being Jewish, cultural, not religious, is very strong. My family is also biased and prejudiced against people who are not Jewish. There was always this tremendous distrust handed down because of our experiences in Russia and during the war. They were and are terribly racist. One irony is that while I was brought up with the idea that Jews were special, there was a solid barrage of messages that being too Jewish wasn't good. Beauty was the American, or rather WASP, look. Blonde, blue-eyed, thin, and the less Jewish you looked, the better. The word shiksa, and to be told you look like a shiksa, was the ultimate compliment. I early learned that I was not to be loud, and that I should not appear cheap, and that my speech had to be free of Jewish intonation. Otherwise, I would be, I don't want to say this word, Kikey, and be called a Kike. In other words, I was to associate only with Jews, but be a non Jewish Jew. Again, I see this as coming from my mother's experience, and it is in a very misguided effort to protect us, since it also meant a lot of self hating. I grew up in a Christian neighborhood and really experienced very little anti Semitism, or at least did not feel much affected. I had the typical experience of being told I killed Christ, and once, as the only Jew in a summer camp, was treated as something of a curiosity. My worst experience was, in the 1950s, not being able to find housing in Baltimore until my husband and I figured out that we should use first names only. Then we found an apartment. I think I've done a lot of denying of the extent of anti Semitism and how people feel about Jews, what people actually think of Jews. It's something that can hurt terribly. I had black playmates when growing up, but in junior high and high school, there was really this rule that blacks and whites could socialize in school but not outside. I had fights with my mother over this, and though she was and thought she was a terrible hypocrite. But my protest was brief, and I was really caught up in dating and being popular. So I was a pretty unconscious kid. Later, in nursing school in New York, in a Hispanic section, most of my patients were Puerto Rican. I visited their homes and became friendly with two families, so I had some experience and exposure to people of a culture different from my own. Afterward, for the entire time I was married, my world was white and mostly Jewish. And I felt very limited and that this was not right. Later, in St. Louis, I really liked this black woman, and I think we could have become strong friends since there was a lot of mutual respect. But she felt very self-conscious that I was white and that our friendship stayed superficial. I'm in a relationship with a West Indian woman and becoming friends with Norma. She and I see a lot of each other, so I think that I am beginning to learn what interracial relationships mean and to take some hard looks at myself. Cheryl. I am a white working class woman. I was born here in Cambridge and we lived in the projects until I was going into third grade. Then we moved to the suburbs, which were totally white. In the town I lived in and on my street, the differences between who were people were who was Protestant and who was Catholic. I knew two Jewish kids in high school, and they were cousins. And there were three black kids that I knew in school who were not related at all, but had the same last name. I remembered as a kid thinking how strange that was. My mother's side of the family had been in this country for at least 4 generations. She identifies herself and all of us as American. My father's mother was an immigrant from Ireland. Father's family had been in this country for 2 generations, but her influence caused him to be Irish American identified. We always did big things on St. Patrick's Day. I married, and within my marriage became a hippie, and lived in Virginia in a very white world with other white hippies. I moved back to Boston when I separated from my husband and still traveled in white circles. Came out as a lesbian with another white woman, lived in a group with only white skinned women. I remember once when we were walking down the street in Dorchester, an obviously Irish American man came up to me and made some remark about how it was good to see more of us in the neighborhood. All the busing was going on at the time with the racial troubles in South Boston, so it became less and less important to own any of my Irish heritage and more important not to have racism come near me because I had linked those two together. Irish Americans are racist. I don't want to be racist. Therefore, I totally stopped relating to that part of myself. I also totally stopped relating to my family. That was much more due to my separatist politics than anything else. And then I met Julia, who I thought was a wonderful woman, full of life, a very caring, lots of energy, and she had a kid. At that time, I had two kids I was responsible for. That she was Puerto Rican was something that I knew in a very shallow way. I had no idea I know now. I would say it was next to nothing. On the other hand, Julia began her relationship with me with a lot of experience with interracial relationships. Norma. Right. For minority, third world, black, Hispanic, Puerto Rican women, all our relationships are interracial relationships in terms of our contact with the outside world. My first awareness that being Puerto Rican might be bad was in first grade. I remember that my teacher did not like Puerto Ricans, but I did not know what that meant. I'm not sure what I knew at age 5 about being Puerto Rican, but I knew I was Puerto Rican, and she did not like Puerto Ricans, and that made me very quiet in her classroom. I was the first one to go to school from those of my family that were born here. I think I went to school not talking much English. I understood a lot of it, and I may have already started reading. My sister Julia took me to the library as soon as I could learn to write at 4 or 5. So I was reading English and I was listening to it and I understood it, but I think I wasn't talking it much. This teacher definitely stopped me from talking at all in the first grade. In the second grade, I think that for me. Also, I believe it was the first time I had some contact with people who were not in my family. My mother was very protective because of the environment we grew up in. We lived in a very poor neighborhood in the South Bronx, and I think my mother's concern was that anything could happen outside. She was very frightened for us, which meant I didn't get to go play outside, and there were lots of rules. I didn't get to think, drink, smoke, breathe, anything. If you could think of a don't do, my mother had it down to a T. I think some of that carries over with my son sometimes, but I try not to be protective of him in the way my mother was with me, because the environment he is growing up in is not the same that I grew up in. And so I have to catch myself. Sometimes my anxiety is out of proportion to what's going on in the environment. I think a lot of that anxiety comes from the early anxiety that my mother had about the environment. I've described my first experience. I've described my first experiences. The one that stood out more later is the fact that as we were growing up, my mother made us not talk Spanish to her anymore because she saw that the world would hurt us in school. She would talk to us in Spanish, but we would always respond to her in English. That went on throughout my childhood, and by the time I was 12 or 13, I wanted to know Spanish. My mother made fun of us speaking Spanish. We sort of lost it as kids, and then we were trying to gain it back. I think 12 or 13 was the time when I was trying to gain back my language and my culture. There was more of a sense of my knowing that I was non white, knowing that I was Puerto Rican, knowing that I needed that connection with my own language. I know that mom was proud. Well, I don't know if she was necessarily proud of being Puerto Rican. I'm not sure of that. My father was very anti American, against American politics in Puerto Rico. His politics helped in defining us, at least for me, in the process of defining myself as being Puerto Rican. That's something that I had to come back to. I defined myself as being non white, and as a young woman, and as a young person, I identified much more strongly with being black. Then I started redefining myself as being a mix, redefining myself as having a lot of different things, of having a different experience of being Puerto Rican. At 19, part of that search made me go back to Puerto Rico. I spent a year in Puerto Rico. I was reclaiming my roots. At the same time, I realized I'm not Puerto Rican like the island Puerto Rican. I'm Puerto Rican in my sense of being here, and I realized I was the Puerto Rican American. My history, my struggle starts here. One of the Puerto Rico Americans who's here and is not planning to go back to the island, who doesn't have the kind of connection to the island. I have roots in history and culture from there, but that's not where I would wind up. Yet, I was being really caught up in wanting the island of independent to be independent and wanting to have Puerto Ricans have control of their own lives. I realized I did not live there and I did not have the power to say something about that. But I can tell people here what happens to the island, the conditions on the island, the poverty, the way colonialism has really shoot up and fucked up the people on the island. It is a place that had its own problems, but in a way, the Americans have done us in, and the people are exploited economically. I think that's where the roots of my nationalism and my politics are from. I feel growing up in the 60s during the civil rights movement gave me the sense of what it was to be proud of who I am. Through that struggle around class and nationalism came my feminism. So I think I started defining myself as a feminist when I was in my 20s. Sarah. I'm interrupting. We really need to get back to the issue of women in interracial relationships. What I was struck by was both Cheryl and Norma saying that being women of color, most of our relationships would be interracial. Norma, yes. Sarah. And that doesn't happen for a white person who can go her entire life and only know white people. Norma. I think that you're right in pointing that out. That definitely is the case in truth all along. Sarah. What about women friends? Norma. My oldest friends have been Puerto Rican, have been black, have been Jewish, have been everything. The first woman I had feelings towards was this woman named Laura. I was going through my bisexual phase. She was, I would say, basically black, but one of those blacks who's been so mixed throughout their history in this country that they are like everything. She was Creole and Madagascan and Trinidadian and French. She looked like me. She had long hair and looked like me. And yet, there were differences because of her experiences. She was culturally a product of a lot of interracial mixtures. We would have these conversations about cousins of hers who were what she really called "paisans blancs," passing for white for generations. Oh, passant blanc. You know that they are your cousins, but you can't talk to them because you don't want to blow their cover of passing for white. We'd have conversations about what that meant to her, what not being able to identify totally as black because of her appearance, yet not being able to identify as white. There's no category to even identify with here in this country, particularly as mixed as she was. Cheryl. One of the things that strikes me is the lack of history of interracial relationships in this country. In general, there is an intense denial that interracial relationships exist. In fact, any racial mix at all, and you're black. Norma. One thing I know about differences is that I had a sense of history and culture and a connection, even though I was a product of a lot of mixtures of white and African, and black and Indian, that I had a history and a culture, which Laura did not have or had lost. Julia, not lost, robbed, assaulted, raped. She did not lose it, she was robbed of it. Sarah, I guess I'm still concerned we don't seem to be getting to the purpose of this conversation, and I'm wondering, Julia, one of the things I'm feeling right now is that generally these types of conversations create an incredible amount of anger because I think it's a very privileged kind of thing to say, let's sit here and let's get to the fact when there are two things that happen. One is you can sit there from a white woman's position and say, this is the kind of thing I've run across about interracial relationships and this is how I grew up. But coming from a perspective of a person of color, there is so much pain that's involved in being dehumanized in this society, starting from going to schools. You know, you walk out your door and it hits you. Sometimes, if you're in an interracial relationship, you don't have to even walk out your front door for some kind of racist bullshit to hit you. Even to get in touch with those kinds of situations is hard, and you have to kind of touch it a little bit so that you don't start beginning to feel the pain. And then after opening up, have to deal with it once you're gone. Because I have to be honest and say that the worst form of racism that came at me was not from men, it was not from the whole social structure as it is. But it isn't the whole situation of institution of racism and all that. But from people I trust, loved, and cared for and knew. Women, feminists, who thought that they had it so together on racism, who knew what it was like, who insulted me to my face and didn't know that they were doing it. I see it happen in relationships. I've seen it happen in my relationship with Cheryl. It doesn't happen anymore with us because we've worked and struggled, and it's a motherfucker. To make some kind of sense about what interracial relationships are, to be able to talk about it, even sitting in a room with two white women talking about it, even as close as we are, creates a problem that is not one we bring on, but that is imposed on us. I've worked really hard many times not to see Cheryl as a white woman, but I've come home sometimes from a long stretch at work, and that's who I see. I see something happening in the street, and I come home, and I don't come home to a place where everybody looks like me. So sometimes you need time to sort it out because it's too much pain to be shared with someone you don't really know that well. I go to conferences and I see it happening all the time. White women come and they say, quote, "We're open, let's talk about it. Let's get it together. We have an hour," end quote. And then you see these women of color sitting around maybe days, in stirred up garbage. I'm sitting here and laying down that this is the kind of stuff that really pisses me off. Even thinking about being a kid in this country makes me want to go outside and beat somebody up. Maybe what you need to do is talk and then sort it out and say, okay, what is it we need to do? Maybe we need to talk about relationships with women. But I'll tell you something. Some of the most vicious people I've met in this place are women. Because I trust women, I leave myself open to women. I don't leave myself open to men. I don't trust them. You need 2 hours just to get down to it. And that's part of the cultural stuff too. Our cultural stuff says we sit down, we have a coffee, we eat, we sit down, we talk, we move. And American culture says, okay, we have a schedule, we have a time limit. And we live with that. We live with your culture. I know more about you than you know about me. Even your being Jewish, I know more about. I'm sure you don't know about my culture as much as I know about yours, about my customs, about my holidays, or Cheryl's. Because we have to know to survive. We never can operate in our own time frame. Sarah. Time frame? Cheryl. You know, Julia and I stumbled across that early in our relationship. When we would get into discussions about something, and I would want it to be logical, precise, clear, short. Stick to the facts, ma'am, and we would be rambling. And I would lose patience, and she would say, quote, "Wait a minute, this is how I talk, this is me. I don't talk like you talk," end quote. Sarah, it's true. I try to be direct, get right down to it, make things real clear. But you do a lot of talking wide. You divert and digress, and I have to stay with it. It's different. Cheryl, it is. It's a cultural difference. That's one of the things that I learned. Julia talked about having to define herself better with me. In my ignorance, I sat down. I sat there, demanding, absolutely demanding, quote, "Listen, this is taking too long. How come you're off the subject? You're avoiding the issue," end quote. That was a good one, right? Quote, you're avoiding the issue, you're not dealing with the situation, end quote. It really was not true. Julia, I can't tolerate it, and I don't work on that time frame. Cheryl, so one of the things about being in an interracial relationship is your home is not a refuge. If you're like Julia and Norma, your home is not a refuge. Julia, another thing, people who learn how to speak Spanish, they have no concept of what the culture is. They learn the language, but never the concept. I've seen women who've had relationships with women who speak another language. They learn the language, but they never learn what it means. And sometimes they think they speak the language better than you. Norma, that's what privilege is, having access to another person's language and thinking that's enough. Sarah, I know I came in here in a rush and said, okay, let's get right to it, without thinking through how much pain this would expose. And something that does not help me understand it is that I translate stuff into my own experience. If somebody said to me, quote, okay, let's sit down for an hour and talk about the Holocaust, end quote, I would go crazy. What I'm saying, what I'm saying is, I've been having to deal with hurt, embarrassment, and hurt when I take in that I've been stupid and insensitive. Norma, okay, listen. What I have learned was how to adapt like crazy and to blatantly deny. That has even happened with lovers. I adapted. I think that's the hardest part. Looking at a lesbian relationship and how we sometimes try to make ourselves, try to make us one with all those differences. I think some people just bury their heads in the sand rather than deal with them. Cheryl. I remember an article by a black woman. It might have been Audre Lorde. She was saying how in interracial relationships, the woman of color always has to reinvent the pencil. And my reading that and knowing it was true, fundamentally knowing it was true and really wishing it wasn't. Really wishing that that was not something that I brought to my relationship with Julia. But I know there's something I have brought and continue to bring in different ways. Who wants to hear that this is a burden I bring to this relationship by my ignorance and by my white skin privilege? There are give and takes in both directions, that's true. For a white woman to enter into an interracial relationship, there are a lot of risks taken. My family cares for Julia. They really care for her. But I know that if I was in a relationship with a white woman, when I go to my mother's house, I would not have some of the tension that I have now when I'm there, that someone is going to say something racist. Racism is no longer on a theoretical level for me. It's a very emotional issue. Even if it doesn't come in my direction, it comes in the direction of my family, Julia, and our children, and that makes it a whole different issue for me. Julia, one of the things that happens in the house, too, has to do with when we fight. We may be having a very reasonable argument, but I will not budge. What's behind my not budging is this: I already give so much of myself outside, and I have to conform so much, and I have to live according to those rules, that when I'm in the house, I don't want to have to do it anymore. So then, so then, Cheryl says to me, quote, well, what about me, end quote, and I say, quote unquote, who cares? You know, sometimes it comes to the point of, quote, no, I am not going to do it your way, end quote. It may be a very reasonable request, but doing it her way is like everybody else's way out there. Cheryl, and I have to learn to say in those situations, quote, wait a minute, we have a commitment to an interracial relationship here. That means some of that stuff, unfortunately, you have to leave at the door, end quote. And it's not enough for you to say to me, quote, look, I have to deal with all of those people out there and compromise myself, or not be totally who I am, or have to deal with people who don't see me as who I am, end quote. Julia. So I don't want to have to deal, Cheryl. So I don't want to have to do it with you. And I've had to learn to say, you know what? That's not always acceptable. I can understand what you're saying, and I feel really badly that that's true. But on some issues between you and me, I've learned that I have to say, quote, I'm really sorry that's true, but this is between you and me, end quote. And this is one of the things it means to be in an interracial relationship. It means, yes, you do have to come home and face those things again. I hope in not the same insensitive way as you face them other places. I hope I've gotten enough education around racism and culture that it won't be to the same extent. It doesn't mean I don't have my slips. It doesn't mean I'm not capable of saying the wrong thing. It doesn't mean I don't feel hurt when I'm confronted with it. I mean, I feel like a piece of shit. When I'm confronted by somebody I care about saying to me, quote, Cheryl, listen to what you just said. Think about that. You have enough information to think about that, end quote. And I sit there and think about it, and it's true. And then I think, oh God. Getting stuck in that place saying, oh God, keeps it from moving. Because I was capable of setting up a little dynamic of feeling guilty, then saying, quote, you know what? I'm really sorry, end quote. Owning it myself, having my own process around it, talking about it within my white woman friends and being able to deal with it, but necessarily working it out with Julia because it's not fair. It's just not fair. Really, the issues in an interracial relationship are complicated on a day-to-day basis. And with kids, when you have an interracial kid in the same household, it is even more complicated. Julia. I knew this white woman who believed that in her previous life, she was a Caribbean goddess. What a trip! She was in a relationship mostly with women of color, mostly black women, and she would say that she had this affinity for women of color, and it was because in her previous life she was one. Cheryl. Basically, I felt she thought she was no damn good. The only place she would feel superior to anyone was in a relationship with somebody of color. But what is true is that as white people, we are taught racism right from the start. To me, it's like a bag I have. I have this bag of racist thoughts, and I can, at any given moment, in anger, when I feel pushed, when I feel fearful, when I feel in any way under stress, I can reach into the bag and pull out something to address that, if one of the feelings I have is directed towards or around a person of color. Okay. Sarah, I remember this woman telling me that she had this lineage of family over on the Mayflower. She said that when she felt at all vulnerable about herself, she would think that the other person was Jewish or was working class, and she would think that to herself to feel better. I've never really I've never heard anybody be so out front with something like that. I never dreamed that people would do that so self-consciously. I think that men probably do that with women. Cheryl, I'm sure. Sarah. What I was very aware of at the beginning of one relationship was how visible I felt to her. I felt with her. I felt like it was like wearing placards that said lesbian, and that was very unsettling. I had such self-consciousness. She and I were able to talk about it some, but I was also very fortunate that I knew other lesbians in interracial relationships who understood. So anyway, there was this real uncomfortable self-consciousness, not so much in gay bars, but certainly out on the street. With one of my lovers, I had this delusion. Her family was quite well off, and I had this delusion that my being coupled with her might eventually, and this is the classism, make my lesbianism acceptable. She was sort of like everything that my family would have wanted their children to be. This was really delusional thinking. And so, with this black woman, it was like thinking that there it goes, this fantasy. I knew that there was no way my family would accept my being a lesbian if I was a black woman. Their acceptance was something that I would have to give up. I was on my own. Cheryl, you blew it. Sarah, yeah. Cheryl, because now you just crossed that line. Sarah, and I really had to face that. Julia, if you get into a relationship with a white woman, you could probably live any way you choose. You could just come and go as an adult. But it becomes an issue between the two of you if she wants to live somewhere. Then you need to think about where is this that she wants to move. Norma, well, when I moved west, the lover I was with, found this place in a working class neighborhood, predominantly white, a southern working class neighborhood, that if we walked out the door, we would pray for our fucking lives. Cheryl. So white women get into relationships with women of color and say, quote, "Hey, let's go to this restaurant. It's really great." End quote. Well, is that restaurant a safe place to go? Is that bar a safe place to go? Is that neighborhood a safe place to go? Going to beaches is another place, and it really brings a point to me about homophobia versus racism. I feel as a lesbian I can go with a white woman lover to any beach. Maybe there'll be some harassment. I don't really fear for my real life, or I don't fear for her life. When I was in the relationship with this white woman, we went everywhere. I'm not a very affectionate person in public anyway, but anyone who knows, cued into this possibility of women together being lesbians, would know she and I were, but I felt safe going places. We go to the beach now and we have to think, quote, "Is this a safe beach for us?" End quote. Last year, they beat up a Puerto Rican man at Revere Beach with a fucking tire iron. We don't go to Revere Beach this year. And you know what? That's an easy beach for us to get to. We used to be able to just hop on the train. That's not a risk we're willing to pay for now. Julia, and you could easily go to Revere Beach by yourself. Cheryl, hey, I could go to Revere Beach in a moment and I'd have no problems. Julia, it was like when I went to Western Massachusetts. We were there for 2 days. I just wanted to see one person who was brown or dark brown or light. I didn't see anybody. And then one day we went to the movies and there was this black couple with kids and I looked at them and I just grinned at them and I wanted to say, "Hi, how are you?" They looked at me like I was odd because they probably said, "That woman is very strange. She doesn't know who we are and she's grinning at us." I felt so glad to see somebody. I mean, you do become self-conscious after a while if you're in a place where you never see anybody who looks like you. And then I will say, I hate this country. I hate this country. I want to go back to Puerto Rico. And that's what I want to do. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. Norma, you feel like you're in a zoo. Cheryl, or you get looks. I have got looks from people that are so clearly on their face. Quote, "What are you doing with that woman?" End quote. Nothing said, but in it looks like, you could do better. Cheryl, well, right. I can remember the first time Julia said to me, "Negrita," and it was like, oh my god, I did not know what to do. I knew from what she was saying it was affectionate, but there was this feeling that that does not belong to me, this is wrong. She should not use that word to me. And I said, quote, "Wait a minute. How can you do that?" End quote, Julia said. Quote, "Hey, it has nothing to do with that. It's an affectionate term. It means I care for you. It means honey, sweetheart. It doesn't have anything to do with color." End quote. But to me, it was like, wait a minute, something's really wrong here. And I did not want to accept it. It felt to me that I was overstepping my bounds. I was accepting something I should not accept. Sarah. One of my most alienating experiences was living in a small town where there were very few Jews. Christmas was the most difficult time. The entire town was lights and wreaths and trees. It was like living in the middle of a Christmas card. I remember being very, very depressed around Christmas and a friend saying to me, quote, "Maybe you should go out of the house. Why don't you go caroling?" End quote. It was the worst thing she could have said. It wasn't malicious, just insensitive, out of ignorance. Cheryl, I think with Jews it's really a different experience because you're white skinned, but there's a level where you're no different than I am. So you get into thinking you have privilege, but Sarah, you deny it. Julia, you deny it. You absolutely deny it. Deny that they, sorry, you absolutely deny that when they come to get us, they'll get you too. Sarah, my level of denial about the way people feel about Jews is unbelievable. I remember watching television and hearing Jews talked about as a different race. I never thought I was a different race. Julia, the reality is here that anybody that they see as different is going to be another race, but you do have privilege. Sarah, what I was taught is that Jews were special and that I shouldn't associate with anybody that wasn't a Jew. And never ever, it was absolutely forbidden that you should ever marry a non Jew. That was as if in my bones. But on the other hand, half the girls I knew had their noses fixed. Remember we talked about hair? In a Jewish home, you never have a Jewish home without tweezers. because you get rid of all the hair so you look more American. Jews are hairy. There were so many messages that we weren't okay the way we were. Everything had to be shaved, plucked, your nose fixed, hair dyed. I'm not kidding. You have no idea of the issues around hair in my family. My mother had facial hair, which she bleached. We did all that to be made into a marketable American. Julia, it's a fact that anti Semitism equaled color. I know there was something I had to struggle with myself. When I first came here, there was this woman who I particularly hated. She happens to be a disgusting human being. She could do anything. She could be any color. She would still be disgusting. So, the first thing that came to my head was that she was Jewish, and it had to do with the fact that when I was growing up, our immediate oppressors were Jewish. Norma, the landlords, Julia, right, the landlords. Cheryl, but the only man who would give Julia a job in Florida was a Jewish man. Norma. There was this Italian woman who I met in California whom I liked a lot. We who liked me a lot. She told me that for someone who was Puerto Rican, I was very nice. I was an exception to whatever rule she had, and there was no way to get through to that rule. And she always treated me decently, but I always had to deal with her racism. It was constant. Julia. We were exceptions. That was what it was like to her. Norma. And that happens to me often, of being the exception. Julia. You have a conference, you have a woman of color come. She covers the range of women of color, all the color represented in the one woman. Laughter. Cheryl. But talk about built in stress in a relationship. All the other million stresses you can have between two women. Put two women of different cultures and or races together and you have built-in stresses. Add kids to it and you have multiplied those stresses by 10. You know what stress we didn't talk about? That's the stress of having to be careful who I go to when having a problem with you. And you have to be careful who you go to when you have a problem with me. Julia, that's true. Cheryl, I have to know if the person I go to for support is going to be paying attention to any racism that they may catch me in, and any racism that may come up, and to be fair in an exchange. Julia has to be careful that it's someone who supports the idea of an interracial relationship, someone who will be honest with her about her role in the particular disagreement and not just come down on me. We really had to sort out who we go to when we each need to go to someone else and how carefully we have to make those choices. I would be a liar if I sat here and said there weren't times when in the beginning I wasn't tempted to go to someone I knew would say Julia was wrong. So you have to be careful when you go for support. Julia, when you go for support, you don't have what that particular person's issues are, race or culture. I've had women say to me, "Oh god, how can you sleep with a white woman?" I lay down and spread my legs, you know. You do it with a white woman like you do with any other woman. I used to be invited to places where Cheryl wouldn't be invited. So you know what? I didn't go. Cheryl can't go, I don't go. You know, people say to me, "Oh, you have no sense of community." Bullshit. My community is my home. That's my community. I carry it with me. You either like it or you don't like it. I'm not going to become a member of some community in Dorchester or Jamaica Plain or Cambridge or anywhere else because you happen to be the same color as me. Cheryl. And yet, there's no way that you can go into there knowing enough. I think there's no way a white woman can go into an intercultural relationship and have enough information. There's no way. Not unless she's already had 20 years with a woman of the same racial and cultural background before. Knowing from my perspective that I'm the one who's going to blow it, I'm the one who's going to learn at Julia's expense. I don't want to do that yet, and that's how it works. Sarah, it makes for a real self consciousness, which is terrible. Cheryl, yep. Norma, because then you can't be yourself with anybody, Cheryl. That's right. It can be It can be every conversation you have. You're preoccupied with, quote, am I hearing this right? Am I going to say the wrong thing? What's the right thing to say? End quote. You can't be doing all that and still be giving the person that you're with 100%, you know? Already, it's an interference before you even open your mouth. If you've gotten to a place where you are so self-conscious that you're not being there the way you want to be there because you're half someplace else. Sarah. That's what beginnings are like. Cheryl. Yeah, that is the beginning. And then the next place is to know, yes, I am going to blow it because that's who I am. And I'm going to try my hardest not to do it, to educate myself. Then the next place for me was to feel really sad about the times when I blew it up and I would hurt someone I cared about. And there was no way that I could make it different because the only other way I could try to make it different would be to take that step back, to become so self conscious again. You work on paying attention to what's going on, and you work on getting yourself as much of an education as you can get, and then knowing you're going to blow it again, and you really hope you don't. You really hope it's not the most horrendous thing, and you're going to cause people pain, and you cause yourself pain in the process. Julia. There's another issue too that bothers me sometimes in terms of respect. We have to respect each other and then be able to move to hear what people say. Sometimes I've seen white women who will take all kinds of disrespect and feel it's okay because it's a woman of color. And, quote, I'm so racist anyway that she has the right to treat me this way. End quote. Sarah, that's the liberal guilt. Julia, right. I'm of the opinion that no one has the right to treat you in a disrespectful manner, no matter who you are. There are some ways that you don't let anybody talk to you. And if it's a woman who is white and you're white and she talks to you that way, you'll say, quote, wait a minute, why are you treating me this way? End quote. Quote, well, I may have done something that's racist. End quote. Quote, that's true. You may have. End quote. But you still want within that relationship to be respectful. Lots of times in our relationship, I want Cheryl to respect me. So therefore, in turn, I feel like I must respect her and what her belief system is. That doesn't mean I'm going to permit her to do really disgusting things to me. And I don't want her to let me do disgusting things to her. Sarah. A fight I had with one particular lover was over negative remarks about white people, white men. She'd call them white boys. Finally, I had to say to her that she shouldn't do that because I'm white. She would then say I didn't understand white men's privilege. I understand white men's privilege, but I couldn't let her do that. One thing that was helpful was that my daughter was in an interracial relationship. It's strange how mothers and daughters get reversed. We talked about this, and she said she had a big fight with her boyfriend because she was white and he couldn't go around saying that stuff about white people in front of her. This also can happen when the person is angry for other reasons. Norma, you can't use color as name calling, no matter what direction it goes. Julia, although it's an easy thing to do. Sarah, I understand what's been done to people of color by white people, but when you're in an interracial relationship, you're not free to be out with your anger the way with other that way with the other person. Cheryl, I remember what felt to me to be a real risk taking and turning point for me in terms of that particular struggle. Something happened for Julia. She came in and she was not wanting to work something out between us because of something that happened outside. I was finally feeling safe enough and strong enough to take the risk and say, quote, you can't do that here in that way, end quote. Before that, I wouldn't have taken that risk. I would have taken what Julia had to say. But on this particular issue, it was important enough for me to stand there and say, quote, wait a minute, I'm really sorry, but you have a commitment to this relationship, and that means dealing with me. And I'm really sorry about the other stuff that's happened, but what can I say? End quote. And that felt very much like a turning point for me, and a turning point for us, that we could have that kind of conversation. Julia, places I've been to, the kind of people I've worked with, that that really say racist things, and I come back home and I don't have any place to go with it, you know? And it's not like I can even vent it and say, quote, oh, those fucking white assholes, end quote, and get really disgusting as I want and get really disgusting as I want to get. I'd be letting it out at Cheryl. So then what happens is that some little incident might happen in the house that would be insignificant, or I would blow it up and make it a racial incident, even if it isn't. Or I sometimes have the feeling of just sort of not wanting to be around any other human being. And sometimes the only human being I want to see is another Puerto Rican, or I don't want to see anybody. I don't want anything that requires me to think, feel, or react to anything. It's like overkill. Cheryl. Talking about the similarities and differences, I remember when I first began my relationship with Julia, when I heard from one white woman that they were very angry with me, that I would be so arrogant as to think I was a white woman, to think that I, as a white woman, would have anything to offer a woman of color. Anything. They were just totally put out that I would think that there was anything that could exist between us where could also give. That was where I got my initial disapproval from white women friends. Sarah. I had just the opposite experience. It was racism in its opposite form. Anytime I introduced a friend to a black woman, they would tell me how wonderful she was. It's not that I doubted her personableness. It was too fast to get the sense of anybody was wonderful. And it was just like their way of saying how, Julia, accepting they were. Sarah. Initially, I felt very good. Then I thought, this too is weird. This is too repetitive. Cheryl. Now I'm going to say something different. And that is, I think interracial relationships are very high and very wonderful. My life feels much more rich than it's ever been before. I have much more understanding not only of Julia and some understanding of her culture, but of understanding of myself. I feel like my daughter's life is so much more enriched than my life was. Julia, we are all getting the goodies of learning. There are different ways to do different things, learning not to be judgmental, learning to try to pay attention to differences, and the kids are learning that young. Cheryl, we're learning it, but this is the best my life has ever been. With the struggles that they are, this is really the best that my life has ever been. Julia, Sarah, your relationship with women of color have been a real catalyst to set you thinking about some of the issues that create the pain. Sarah, I know, I felt a lot of things that I didn't like about myself in the relationship. What I have to count on is I think I'm a good person. I may do things I don't mean, do shit, but I have basic belief in myself. So, okay, I feel this. I know this. Now, what's the next step? Julia. And we all want to be good girls. We all want to be nice girls. Cheryl. But we also need to have these conversations because we do start out wanting to be good, not wanting to have any of that shit fall on us. And already know we have it, and you don't want to hurt somebody else. Julia. You don't want to be called racist. Cheryl. That's right. No one wants to be called racist. There need to be more conversations among white women about what these things mean to us. What does it mean to have somebody call you on your racism? What does it mean to sit there and suddenly realize that you have said something that is at least inappropriate and at most downright offensive? And you didn't mean it. You didn't mean for it to mean what you said. But in your ignorance you did it, and you can't take your words back because they're there. And how do you deal with that? White women need to come together and talk about that kind of stuff to give ourselves strength. We really need to, as white women, we really need to have a lot more conversations about these processes and how we work it out, and take the heat off the individual relationships in those ways too.